Okay, so let's finish up the American Civil War. Get to 1865. This will be part one. There will be part two coming, which will focus on the assassination and what comes after. But first, let's finish with Tecumseh before we move on to Appomattox and the final surrender. Part two of Sherman's mission was now set to take place. He had captured Atlanta, then went on to Savannah. Next, at the end of January 1865, he would turn northward to trap Lee's troops, and in doing so, hopefully, destroy the will of the Carolinians. North Carolina was spared for the most part because he did not consider it responsible for the rebellion. But South Carolina was a different story. Destruction returned. South Carolina suffered a much worse fate than Georgia, primarily because it was the first state to secede, but also many of its leaders had convinced other states to join the CSA, the Confederacy. Many of these South Carolina leaders literally went on the road to try to bring these other southern states into the Confederacy. So Sherman blamed South Carolina, and his troops would destroy the state's infrastructure. They would converge on Columbia, which would be captured on February 17th. Sherman's men set numerous fires which consumed the city and continued to destroy railroad lines and any forms of transportation and communication. Charleston would soon be abandoned. Now, later, and this is a little bit out of chronological order, but Joseph Johnston would surrender at Durham Station, North Carolina, after being defeated at the Battle of Bentonville in April 65. This included surrender of all troops in Georgia, Florida, and the Carolinas. Now, what's notable about this? Truman, true to form, offered a lenient peace plan. It was so lenient, in fact, that many in the northern states questioned his loyalty. One example of Sherman's actions in North Carolina were communicated by Chapel Hill resident Cornelia Phillips Spencer in her work, The Last 90 Days of the War in North Carolina. The focus of this book is on the last 90 days of the war in North Carolina. She speaks of the fear that Tecumseh had instilled and that many in North Carolina dreaded his entry into and proposed destruction of the state. She speaks of the reputation of his of laying waste in his wake, but she also claimed that he, quote, manifested an eager anxiety to save the South from further devastation. He has shown himself at once generous and politic. He had advocated a humane forbearance toward the defenseless people who were crushed beneath his march. She would go as far as to claim he was, quote, the hero of the war on the northern side. This is an example of Tecumseh's pragmatism, right? Of course, he is labeled a war criminal. He was awful. He was evil. But he actually was, he chose how he reacted depending on the actions of the others. So North Carolina, for example, with Johnston, he surrenders peacefully. He does not fight back, knowing he's defeated. Sherman takes it easy on him. Areas of South Carolina where they continue to fight, he's not going to take it easy on them. So again, when you think about Sherman, remember some of these nuances, because too often we try to label people and that's it. So with all this, the fall of the Confederacy is hastened. Supply lines are interrupted by blockades, transportation issues, so that the food and supplies are not reaching the Confederacy as before. Increasingly, the Confederates begin to desert. In February. Now, also noteworthy at this time is a peace conference is offered. Jefferson Davis agrees to send delegates, but states that Lincoln must recognize the independence of the Confederacy. So you're losing and you're trying to make demands. Well, good luck with that. This is obviously denied, right? And the peace conference never occurs. In March, we have the expansion of the Freedmen's Bureau Act, March 3rd, 1865, specifically relegating, quote, control of all subjects relating to refugees and freedmen, end quote, for 1 year after the war. What did the Freedmen's Bureau do? It obtained food and clothing and provided it to those in need. It found work for many, which required contracts between laborers and landlords, which was a little problematic. We'll get to in a minute. They also educated Southern African Americans. Children would go to school during the day, adults at night. They allocated land with some limited success. Really, a total redistribution would have, obviated any kind of real peace. So it was somewhat limited, unfortunately. There were some successes, which we'll get to when we discuss Reconstruction. Now, some of these workers hesitated to sign contracts with white property owners or former slave owners as they felt they would receive their own land, and they did not want to be continued held down. They believed they were going to receive 40 acres and a mule, which which again, we'll get to later down the road. This was something that was offered and promised by some and denied by others, Johnson. Now, before we get to Petersburg, an important quote from Lincoln's inaugural address, which came March 4th of 1865. Quote, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Now, what Lincoln is doing here is saying, let's be peaceful, right? Let's get rid of this idea of vengeance. Let's get rid of idea of vindictiveness. We have to bring this country back together again. Now, spoiler alert, he will be assassinated and he will not be able to lead Reconstruction. And one of the key issues, really, which everything is subsumed under, is that question. The radical Republicans want revenge. The conservatives and the moderates want to bring the country back together again. Many questions will lead Reconstruction, but the main tension for any of those questions falls under that. So let's get to Petersburg, which was the back door to Richmond. Fighting in this area had been occurring since summer of 1864. The Confederacy had finally begun to weaken due to various attacks. This was especially true after the fighting at Five Forks. We see trench warfare play a major role here. That will, of course, be key to World War I and will be why there is a major stalemate for years in that war. But trenches are dug around Petersburg to protect it, complete with abatis, which are big spikes that stick out of the ground to stall in advance. But as the Confederates form their line to protect Petersburg, there is only one man for every 10 feet on the front line. The army is thin, the army is decimated. A Union assault with 14,000 men at night leads the charge. There's cannon fire, hand-to-hand combat, bayonets. The Confederates cannot hold the line. Eventually, the Union breaks through. Lee warns Richmond. He sends a telegram to Jefferson Davis that simply reads, quote, "I advise that all preparation be made for leaving Richmond tonight." And an exodus of the Confederate government takes place by April 2nd. Throughout the day, though, Davis and his colleagues still have faith in Lee, even as they're preparing to leave, that they believe that Bobby Lee will somehow telegram them that the tides have turned, the Army of Northern Virginia can hold back the Union Army, and Richmond can be saved. The war continue. Alas, it was not meant to be. Now, what are the people of Richmond? Not the officials, not the higher ups, not the wealthy, but the average person. They were unaware of the impending doom. Their city had been a goal of the Union since the inception of it as the Confederate capital. They were not aware that General Sheridan and his group were a short distance away. There's little communication and a lot of secrecy. Crowds noticed document burnings in front of the government office, but were told nothing. One man with government connections told a friend he was, quote, "not at liberty to communicate what he already knew." Official word was finally made of the government departure at 4 p.m. One eyewitness said, quote, "the scene that followed baffles description. During the long afternoon and throughout the feverish night, on horseback, in every description of cart, carriage, and vehicle, in every hurried train that left the city, on canal barges, skiffs, and boats, the exodus of officials and prominent citizens was intermitted." Chaos ruled the night of April 2nd in Richmond. The Union Army was closing in. Knowing what happened in Columbia, South Carolina, officials ordered the city to destroy everything that could be of assistance. All liquor was to be destroyed, and there are accounts of crowds going to try to save whatever they could, literally gulping whiskey from the curbstones or using any type of apparatus to sweep it up so they could drink it later. There was also an order to destroy the city's tobacco, cotton, and foodstuffs, so that the Union could not put these to use for their military. But was there much food to destroy in a city known for holding starvation balls? In actuality, speculators had been accumulating and harboring a large variety of goods. Of course, this did not get to the people who really needed it, the people who were hungry. Quote, "taking advantage of their possession of money and lack of both patriotism and humanity, they had, by an early corner in the market and by successful blockade running, brought up all the available supplies with an eye to future gain, while our soldiers and women and children were absolutely in rags, barefoot, and starving." This from a first-hand account. When folks saw commissaries filled with smoked meats, flour, sugar, coffee, and other essentials, they reacted. They snatched the food, they snatched the clothing, they looted nearby shops. Again, these were people that were hungry. They didn't have clothes, they didn't have the basic materials of life. And here you have some of the wealthier people in the city hoarding these items. One can only imagine the anger. Fires were set by officials, and these also grew accordingly. Vandals created paper torches, and these fires, combined with the original, were exacerbated by heavy winds that had hit the town that day, leading to several buildings catching fire, followed by the business district catching fire. When the ironworks caught fire, continual explosions of loaded shells stored there only led to more shock and fear. One explosion of warships' arsenals blowing out windows in a 2-mile area, overturning tombstones and tearing doors off hinges. Wow. In the end, all or part of at least 54 blocks of Richmond were completely destroyed. One eyewitness recounted, quote, "The rebel capital, fired by men placed in it to defend it, was saved from total destruction by the soldiers of the U.S. who had taken possession." So, the Confederate soldiers, under orders from their officials, tried to destroy everything. Union military men came in and preserved it, as much as they could anyway. In April, we get to the end of the war. April 2nd, 1865, the battle at Selma ends. Nathan Bedford Forrest's troops in the city stand strong, but eventually Union columns under General James Wilson break through and take the city. Forrest notably escapes. Again, this is a large psychological defeat. Forrest will remain considered invincible by many Confederates, by many people in the South. He will, of course, be one of the leaders in creating the Ku Klux Klan in the next few years. But Forrest, again, there is a large myth surrounding him. That same day, Lee finally leaves Richmond after twice attacking Grant's armies there and trying to defeat him, but he cannot. He takes his troops west to meet with others. Richmond is left in ruins. Confederates want to leave nothing behind, which may aid the Union in its military. Some skirmishes continue. Lee tries to unite his troops with Johnston's. This is before Johnston had surrendered, obviously. But tries to reunite, tries to turn south to meet him in North Carolina, but troops are cut off by Grant, so Lee heads west along the Appomattox River and arrives in Appomattox County on April 8th. Food supplies await at the South Side Railroad at Appomattox Station, but a guy named George Custer reached them first, capturing, then burning 3 supply trains. Grant asks for a surrender. Lee declines. He heads further west to Lynchburg for supplies, but Union cavalry under Philip Sheridan and 2 other Army Corps, Major General John Gordon, stops the attack. He cannot reach Longstreet's corps, and the army is trapped. Lee and Grant agree to meet at Wilmer McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse. And on April 9th, 1865, Lee surrenders at Appomattox Courthouse. Soldiers are paroled with their horses, meaning they're allowed to go free as long as they promise not to re-engage. Officers are allowed to retain their sidearms. All other equipment was to be surrendered. This was considered considerably generous. This was quite generous. Sorry, word choice there. Grant does not want to embarrass, humiliate, or further hurt the Confederacy. He's won the war, right? He knows he doesn't need to go further. And Grant, as much of a butcher as he was, right, will be one of the key voices during Reconstruction that tries to keep the country together rather than seeking vengeance. Now, another interesting thing at Appomattox before these two men meet, actually when they meet and how they meet, you learn a lot about the two men. Robert Lee arrives in a perfectly coiffed uniform, engraved sword at his side, extremely formal military attire. He wants to look his best. Grant, in contrast, arrives wearing a private's dirty shirt. His trousers and boots are splattered with mud. Lee looks ever the formal, dignified, honorable soldier, whereas Grant looks somewhat slovenly, as if he just woke up, which of course is what we know is kind of more natural with Grant. Lee and Grant would speak casually about their history together, and eventually they would come to these terms that I had mentioned. 3 days later, on April 12th, there's a formal ceremony marking the disbanding of Lee's army and the parole of his men, ending the war in Virginia. Similar surrenders would occur throughout the South, ending the official fighting of the Civil War. Remember, everything is not instantaneous. It takes a while for news to get there. Lee would tell his troops, quote, "After 4 years of arduous service marked by unsurpassed courage and fortitude, the Army of Northern Virginia has been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources." Now, a couple things here. What is Lee saying? He's giving credit to his men, because that's what Lee does, right? That's why his men love him. That's why they'll fight. They'll do anything for him. But he is also setting the foundation for what is known as the lost cause. The lost cause is something that is held onto by many Southerners, even today, that if they had been on a fair fighting field, if they had the same amount of supplies, the same money, the same men, the same industry, they would have defeated the Union. And time will come when the Confederacy will rise again and defeat the Union. This is the concept of the lost cause. And again, you could see the foundation laid right here with Lee. Also notable is that Grant tells his troops not to rub it in, not to try to make fun or try to humiliate Lee's troops. He says that they fought bravely as well and asks them to recognize the end of the war and seek peace. All right. 1865, Part 2, with the assassination of Lincoln as the main part, will be next.